In mathematics, plus and minus, differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the association and dissociation of atoms. In social science, the class struggle. In Valences of the Dialectic, Marxist scholar Fredric Jameson considers three names for the broad philosophical term known as dialectics. Firstly, the dialectic, with an emphasis on the. Maybe we could even call it the dialectic with a capital D to make it a proper noun. A grandiose and all-encompassing philosophical system. Next, dialectics. That is, one or more dialectics. A dialectic of history, dialectic of science, a dialectic of... and so on. A multitude of interactions, without necessarily a unifying metaphysics as in the dialectic with a capital D. And finally, in its adjectival form, dialectical. This could be thought of as dialectics in its germ form, a descriptor for wherein, from some deadlock, the new emerges as if from nowhere, and yet nonetheless whose aspect can be recognized within the paralysis of the old situation. The Thesis, Antithesis, Synthesis Triad, which you have no doubt heard many times, almost passes for common sense among those at least glancingly acquainted with the term. However, it would be an understatement to say that it does not adequately capture the varied meanings and applications of dialectical logic. Dialectics applies its attention to the mutual interactions between all things, the pushes and pulls, the tensions and fractures within things themselves. As Lenin said, dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. It used to be thought that the universe was static and eternal. The clockwork universe of Newton was set in motion, perhaps by the hand of God at the dawn of time, and all cosmic bodies proceeded in an elegant, orderly, and unchanging manner. As Friedrich Engels wrote in Dialectics of Nature, quote, "The planets and their satellites, once set in motion by the mysterious first impulse, circled on and on in their predestined ellipses for all eternity, or at any rate until the end of all things. The stars remained forever fixed and immovable in their places, keeping one another therein by universal gravitation. The earth had persisted without alteration from all eternity, or, alternatively, from the first day of its creation. The 5 continents of the present day had always existed, and they had always had the same mountains, valleys, and rivers, the same climate, and the same flora and fauna, except in so far as change or cultivation had taken place at the hand of man. The species of plants and animals had been established once and for all once they came into existence. Like continually produced like. In contrast to the history of mankind, which develops in time, there was ascribed to the history of nature only an unfolding in space. All change, all development in nature, was denied. Natural science, so revolutionary at the outset, suddenly found itself confronted by an out-and-out conservative nature, in which even today everything was as it had been at the beginning, and in which, to the end of the world, or for all eternity, everything would remain as it had since the beginning." End quote. This static view of nature goes all the way back to the words of the Roman poet Lucretius, who wrote, "The world has persisted for many a long year, having once been set going into the appropriate motions. From these, all else follows." The philosopher Baruch Spinoza, on the other hand, took the perspective that nature was an interconnected whole, and that what we call God is inseparable from nature. This is exactly the metaphysics implied by Engels in the passage quoted here from Dialectics of Nature, and the philosophy of the great 20th century physicist Albert Einstein. Einstein wrote in a telegram to a rabbi, quote, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and the doings of mankind." Non-dialectical philosophy, as Jameson notes, dodges the subject of time, temporality, and appeals to the all-too-human longing for timelessness. That is, the striving towards pure or eternal ideas which weather the storm, survive any attempts to alter them, and in defiance of that wily thing called entropy, never change. Dialectical thought, on the other hand, strives to understand totality. In Hegel's words, the truth is the whole. The materialist dialectics of Marx apply this logic to the social whole. That is, to derive knowledge about society, politics, economy, and history by examining the vast networks of interconnections between their different aspects. Newton's clockwork universe, with its absolute notions of time and space, were upended in the early 20th century by Albert Einstein's theories of special and general relativity. Time and space are not separate, but dialectically entwined. Matter does not simply bounce around in space as though space was an empty medium. Matter curves space-time around it. In the formulation of the astrophysicist John Archibald Wheeler, matter tells space-time how to curve, space-time tells matter how to move. This is dialectical in Jameson's third sense of the word. In all of these formulations, dialectics does not so much imply synthesis, but contradiction as such. The tensions between opposing forces, how one thing affects another, and vice versa. The notion of an interconnected whole, which we can exert ourselves to know, both by looking at our objects of study in isolation and in connection with one another, runs throughout all dialectical thought. The misleading thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad may at first glance appear to capture the notion of transformation through the struggle of opposites, but on closer examination, we can see that it oversimplifies to the point of being incorrect on the whole. For materialist dialectics, that is, dialectics as understood in the physical world, quote, "In order to understand the development of a thing, we should study it internally and in its relations with other things. In other words, the development of things should be seen as their internal and necessary self-movement, while each thing in its movement is interrelated with and interacts with the things around it." End quote. In other words, the natural world, and hence also our social world, unfolds and changes not simply due to a reshuffling of contingent matter, but because of the myriad of forces within, endlessly splitting, twisting, turning, and becoming other. While materialist dialectics applied to historical transformation of political and economic forms is an exercise we're all probably familiar with by now, there is no other better example of materialist dialectics in motion than the history of science. Newton's laws of motion aimed at totality, that is, to enumerate a set of rules that would be valid anywhere, hence Newton's law of universal gravitation. Newtonian mechanics were not so much disproven by the Einsteinian revolution and the advent of quantum mechanics, but shown rather to be a limiting case of those new frameworks on a scale that we as tiny terrestrial mortals are capable of perceiving and acting on in our day-to-day lives without the aid of advanced technological instruments. As Jameson writes in Valences, quote, "The analogy of dialectics with physics is in that case rather to be found in the way in which Newtonian law becomes a mere local system within an Einsteinian cosmos, a set of properties valid for the human scale of our everyday perceptual world, but irrelevant for the twin infinities, Pascal, which bound it on either side, the microcosm and the macrocosm." End quote. Thus the world of Newton, Lagrange, Hamilton, Leibniz, Faraday, and Maxwell is revealed not to be the dialectic with a capital D, but merely a dialectic, a sort of local node within, perhaps, a far greater, as yet undiscovered system. And dare I say that this points us back towards our friend the capital D dialectic itself. We see here at work the way in which two of Jameson's names of the dialectic overlap. One, that Newton's laws were part of the capital D dialectic in the sense that they sought to encompass the universal, and two, that this attempt towards universality, quote-unquote, failed, and was resituated as a moment within a more universal system, Einsteinian gravitation on the one hand, and quantum mechanics on the other. The motion of this second point is what Jameson would use his third name for. The dialectical transformation of one scientific paradigm into another, which negates, partly, Newtonian mechanics and replaces it with quantum mechanics and Einsteinian relativity. We have seen here how Jameson's three names of the dialectic interplay. The capital D dialectic with its all-encompassing metaphysics, our local dialectics of this, that, and the other thing, and the adjectival dialectical. Are we now a step closer to understanding the rich and complex meanings of dialectical thought? My friend Jon, the lit-crit guy, will now turn our attention from the realm of nature to that of culture. Let us demonstrate the connective thread between the two, to see the transformation of one thing into its opposite.
So there's always been a debate over the nature and function of criticism. In a common sense definition, criticism is supposed to tell you whether a given thing is good or not. In the idiom of reviews, it's about letting you know whether a given object, a TV show, a film, Funko Pop, is worth spending your money on. Of course, in the case of Funko Pops, the answer is no. The answer is always no. But generally speaking, a lot of what gets called cultural criticism, especially online, tends to be interested in taxonomies. Where does a given thing fit? To use a kind of gruesome analogy, it's a little bit like butterfly collecting, pinning the specimen in place so that people can appreciate and view it properly. This, of course, has its place, but it rests upon the presupposition that cultural texts can be understood as a discrete object, and that the lines between a cultural text and the society in which it exists can be drawn neatly and clearly. However, if we start trying to think in a bit more of a dialectical way, this all gets much more complicated much more quickly. A big reason for this is that thinking dialectically opens the work and criticism itself up to the idea of motion, of intellectual movement. And it allows for the possibility of a cultural text containing multiple, often competing meanings. So ultimately the question becomes less about whether a certain thing is good or bad, and more about what might a given text become? What might it do? And from a certain point of view, it's not hard to see why people don't particularly like this, mostly because it tends to raise more questions than answers, and tends to resist boiling down texts into easy choices of whether they are good or bad. So here's a question to start with. What is Star Wars? Is it this? This? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Or even is it this? Star Wars gets presented as a text, or rather a series of text, but perhaps it's better thought of as less texts and more a network in constant productive motion. So really, when you start trying to think dialectically, you don't ever come to the final answer. The text never gets closed off into a neat little box. And thus, what I'm trying to do here is not give the dialectical reading of Star Wars, but hopefully to demonstrate how when we use dialectics adjectively, as Jameson puts it, we can come to understand cultural texts in a new and more complex way. In Friedrich Engels' unfinished work, Dialectic of Nature, Engels writes that dialectics is to be thought of as the science of interconnections, as opposed to an idealist and abstract metaphysics. And what's so interesting about Dialectics of Nature, even if a lot of the science in it has been superseded or is now out of date or outmoded, is the way that Engels argues that dialectic processes are universal. This notion of motion, of transformation, of change is built into the universe itself. In the context of Star Wars, we can see some interesting commonalities. What is the Force but something that operates within all life on a molecular level? A kind of universe-wide potentiality. When you look at it this way, the various battles between different Force users are not reducible down to some interpersonal conflict. After all, Anakin, Vader, is simply a symptom of a wider, indeed universal tendency towards motion, transformation, and change. In a plot sense, of course, the links between something like Star Wars and the circular route of the hero's journey developed by Joseph Campbell are well established. But there are some other interesting ways that we can think through Star Wars in terms of its structure and its plot. And a very important one is around the idea of nostalgia. Because really, when you think about it, Star Wars is not a science fiction film, or rather, it's not just a science fiction film. There's a really interesting quote from Jameson in a work called The Cultural Turn. Supposing I suggested that Star Wars is also a nostalgia film, what could that mean? I presume we can agree that this is not a historical film about our own intergalactic past. Let me put it somewhat differently. One of the most important cultural experiences of the generations that grew up from the 30s to the 50s was the Saturday afternoon serial of the Buck Rogers type. Alien villains, true American heroes, heroines in distress, the death ray or the doomsday box, and the cliffhanger at the end, whose miraculous resolution was to be witnessed next Saturday afternoon. Star Wars reinvents this experience in the form of a pastiche. That is, there is no longer any point to a parody of such serials, since they are long extinct. Star Wars, far from being a pointless satire of now such dead forms, satisfies a deep, might I even say repressed, longing to experience them again. It is a complex object in which, on some first level, children and adolescents can take the adventure straight, while the adult public is able to gratify a deeper and more properly nostalgic desire to return to that older period and to live its strange old aesthetic artifacts through once again. This film is thus metonomically a historic or nostalgia film. Unlike American Graffiti, it does not reinvent a picture of the past in its lived totality. Rather, by reinventing the feel and shape of characteristic art objects of an older period, it seeks to reawaken a sense of the past associated with those objects. Seen this way then, Star Wars, or at least the original trilogy, is not about a kind of looking to the future, a forward projection that so much science fiction concerns itself with. It is rather an attempt to recuperate and restyle certain aesthetic modes which have lost their place in historical cultural production. Now, as I said right at the beginning, this tends to raise more questions than answers. We could try and think about why there was this turn to affective nostalgia in the late 1970s and early 1980s. We could trace how cultural production has changed and the ideological influences of various cultural forms through history. From this individual cultural text, or, 3 films, you can get a wider view of not just how culture influences people, but how individual cultural texts connect to broader networks of economic production. Understanding Star Wars as a kind of nostalgia is extremely important when it comes to thinking about contemporary iterations of it. Jameson argued that this nostalgia was essentially an affective mode of engagement for people who saw the original, but increasingly, it functions as a kind of product. The newer versions of Star Wars essentially fractured along these lines, caught between the formal impulse to try and recreate the same nostalgia as the original, but this time it wasn't a nostalgia for people who were raised on the Buck Rogers serials of the 1930s to the 1950s, but was a nostalgia for those who had been raised on the original films. They became a pastiche of a pastiche, marketed, repackaged, and sold to a mass audience. And hopefully that illustrates in some small way the value of trying to think more dialectically about culture, because we start with just a singular cultural object, but you end by being able to not just see into that text more clearly, but how that text connects to the wider nexus of capitalism which it inhabits.
Thanks for watching, and thank you, Jon the LitCrit guy, for co-writing this video with me. And thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support A World to Win financially, go to patreon.com/aworldtowin. If you're new to my channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you get notifications when I put up new videos. Hit the like button and leave a comment. And be sure to share this video with your friends, coworkers, on social media, or directly. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.